Good evening, and to those of you joining us both in for the 2025 Evacuation Day Lecture. This is an annual event that this year I think really marks the official start of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters 250th commemorations, anniversary of the 250th anniversary and start of the American Revolution coming right up. So, headquarters for their generous support of this and so many other events, making these possible, and we are thrilled to have author, historian, steadfast blogger, and true friend of the Longfellow House, J.L. Bell, here to speak with us tonight. So as this site marks the 250th anniversary, we are really focusing in on the idea writ large of the transfer rights to George Washington's first general orders issued from Cambridge, to later 19th century poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's shaping of American memory and identity through his poetry. Those who occupied this house have shaped this country through their actions, but also through their words. And tonight I've been really looking forward to John's insight into how our are shaped too. So just a couple of logistical reminders before I turn it over. Again, we are live streaming to YouTube this evening. The live stream camera is in the back. It's primarily those will be picked up as well as the back of your heads. We will have plenty of time for question and answer after the talk this evening. We will be wrapping up around 7:15. And if at any point folks need restrooms, you just hop out this door right over to the visitor center, which is the back of the big yellow house. Those restrooms are open for you. The house itself will be opening if everything goes according to house. And again, thank you so much for being here. Enjoy this evening's talk, and now I will turn it over to J.L. Bell.
Thank you very much to Emily Moline and everybody in the National Park Service, which is a true national treasure. Thank you to the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, which has been supporting this with the help of the Massachusetts Society. How in the spring of 1775, the Continental Congress came to choose George Washington of Virginia as the commander-in-chief of the army around Boston. And I'll start with the recollections of one man involved in those discussions, John Adams. And many of you may actually have heard Adams' story already or historical accounts based on it. Adams left at least two versions of this story in his autobiography and in later letters. And those accounts are overlapped those documents in the 1850s. So historians have been drawing on them ever since to create sort of the standard story of the choice of Washington. And one of Adams's main points was there was actually strong opposition. New Hampshire Governor William Plumer that the vote was an instance of apparent unanimity and real regret in nearly one half. According to Adams, nearly 40 years later, even though the official record of the Congress said that all the states agreed to choose Washington, wanted Plumer and others to understand that the appointment of General Washington really depended on John Adams. In his autobiography, Adams wrote that he could sense that Washington was the only candidate with appeal to most of the Southern delegates. The intention was very visible to me that Colonel Washington was their object. But not all the Southern delegates were in agreement, Adams wrote. In several conversations, I found that more than one very cool about the appointment of Washington. And particularly, Mr. Pendleton was very clear and full against. That was Edmund Pendleton from Washington's own colony of Virginia. Meanwhile, his own colleagues from Massachusetts were being no help. The Massachusetts delegates, Mr. Samuel Adams, was irresolute. Finally, John Adams made his move. Full of anxieties concerning these confusions, I walked with Mr. Samuel Adams in the State House yard before the hour of Congress, and there represented to him the various dangers that surrounded us. He agreed to them all, but said, "What shall we do?" I answered him that he knew unanimous. I was determined to take a step which should compel them and all the other members of Congress to declare themselves for or against something. I'm determined this morning to make a direct motion that Congress should adopt the army before Boston and appoint George Washington commander of it. John Adams, I rose in my place, and in as short a speech as the subject would admit, represented the state of the colonies, and uncertainty in the minds of the people, the distresses of the army, and the probability that the British army would take advantage of our delays. I concluded with a motion in form that Congress would adopt the army at Cambridge and appoint a general, that those in my mind for this important command, and that was a gentleman from Virginia who was among us and very well known to us, a gentleman whose skill and experience as an officer, whose independent fortune, whose great talents and excellent universal character would command. As soon as he heard me allude to him, from his usual modesty, darted into the library. Or as Adams described the scene later, Washington, who sat but 3 chairs off and not more from the door of the library room, darted into it like a streak of lightning and was seen no more during that deliberation. There's another detail from Adams's memoir that historians often repeat. According to Adams, John Hancock himself had an ambition to be appointed commander-in-chief. He was then presiding over the Washington for the commander. I never remarked a more sudden and sinking change of countenance. Mortification and resentment were expressed as forcibly as his face could exhibit them. Mr. Samuel Adams seconded the motion, and that did not soften the detail in a letter to the Massachusetts Senator James Lloyd in 1815, and even more detail in a long letter he wrote about the same time in response to Virginia Congressman John Randolph, in response to something Randolph had written in a newspaper. We don't know what, probably in fact Adams never actually mailed this long letter, but he wrote it out at great length. And those documents use some of the same phrasing, indicating that he was copying one from the other. And they also fall in to be commander. There were other candidates to be commander-in-chief, Adams wrote. A greater number, can you believe it, were for General Charles Lee, then in Philadelphia, extremely assiduous in his visits to all the members of Congress at their lodgings, and universally represented in America. But the greatest number were for Ward, and that was General Artemus Ward of Shrewsbury, the commander of the Massachusetts troops already outside Boston, and thus of the entire New England force. According to Adams in 1816, the cool and wise Pendleton arose and said he was for adopting the army, but against changing the general. The army was wholly from New England, and they had selected their own. The sagacious Mr. Sherman of New Haven followed Mr. Pendleton on the same side. He was personally acquainted with General Ward, knew him well. He was also well known in several of the colonies, and especially in all of New England. Mr. Cushing spoke with more decision and energy than was usual for him, in honor of his friend Ward and against the appointment of anyone over him. Mr. Richard Henry Lee said a few words against any change of the chief of the army and in favor of appointing a time to consider the adoption of it. Now, Adams hadn't mentioned Richard Henry Lee's story. As time went on, he described the opposition to Washington as more passionate and more determined. As another example, we can look at how Adams recalled the response of his fellow delegate from Massachusetts, Robert Treat Paine. Around 1803, Adams wrote that Paine expressed a great opinion of General Ward and a strong friendship. Spoke with that superb vivacity which he exhibited upon some special occasions for a few minutes against any change. And in the unsent letter, Mr. Paine spoke with zeal against it. Likewise, in 1803, John Adams said that simply Samuel Adams had seconded the motion, but said not one word in support of it. And in his letter to Randolph, Adams had another point that he wanted to emphasize. Randolph had written in this newspaper, to Virginia, we are indebted for a Washington. And as Adams told the story then, prominent Virginians like Edmund Pendleton and who won delegate from Massachusetts, the Congress chose Washington and thus made him a national leader. Adams wrote, we owe you no thanks for Washington. What, Massachusetts made him a general. Virginia never made him more than a colonel. In all of Adams's tellings, after his proposal, the Congress put off a vote to have convinced them of the great importance of harmony, union, and unanimity in so delicate an appointment. And finally, delegates came together to formally nominate 3 candidates, or at least then stated the nominations were made, I believe, by Ward, I believe by Mr. Cushing, Lee by Mr. Mifflin, and Washington by Mr. Johnson of Maryland. Washington was unanimously elected and the army adopted. But were people happy? Not according to Adams, who closed his 1815 account by writing, "Poor John Adams, upon his return to the army and his constituents, had enough to do to apologize for the part he had taken in the change. I was subjected to almost as bitter exprobrations for creating Washington commander-in-chief as I had been 5 years before for saving Preston and his soldiers from an unrighteous judgment and execution." I have to note that there were actually no contemporaneous examples of people criticizing John Adams for defending those men in court. In fact, a few months after he accepted that assignment, Bostonians elected John Adams to represent their town in the Massachusetts. Crucial element of what John Adams wrote about the Revolution decades later in the 1800s, after he had been voted out of the presidency. The common theme was almost always, John Adams taking an unpopular opinion, standing resolutely and nearly alone in the face of opposition and opprobrium, and finally being proved right by history. And there's almost no support for the details of his story from 1775. Now, true, there are a lot of the discussions he talked about. They keep diaries, they did send letters, and historians have had a hard time reconciling that evidence with the details that Adams recalled. For instance, if Edmund Pendleton spoke out very clear and full against appointing Washington as commander, why did Washington ask Pendleton to help write his will and his acceptance speech a few days later? And why didn't John have other disagreements within Congress? So for the rest of this talk, I'm simply going to remove the details of the older John Adams' memory from our consideration. He will appear only as he did in 1774 and 1775 as a Massachusetts lawyer making his first trips out of New England. And I'll look at how the Americans' conflicts with Britain and a certain Virginia planter looked at that time. So, let's start over. Thanks to Emily Levine and the friends of Longfellow House, Washington headquarters. Thank you for coming. Tonight I'm going to army around Boston. And I'll start this story during the first Continental Congress, which met in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia in North American colony. As the oldest and by far the largest colony, Virginia was very important to that gathering. The leader of its delegation was Peyton Randolph, Speaker of the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and he was quickly chosen to preside over the Continental Congress. A young man, a relatively young man in his 40s, George Washington was there too. He was one of the delegates from Virginia. There's no record of him saying any other delegates. First, many people had heard about Washington from the French and Indian War. A report he wrote about a trip into Virginia's governor in 1753 had been reprinted in many American newspapers and in pamphlets. The next year, as a young lieutenant colonel for Virginia, he brought on an embarrassing skirmish that eventually helped spark the 7 Years' War, and a letter he wrote to his brother about that first combat also appeared in many newspapers and eventually in the London Magazine. There is something charming in this sound. And even George III commented on that, but not favorably. He would not think so if he had been used to hear many. And then Washington participated as a volunteer wounded in an attack on that column. He helped to lead the surviving British soldiers to safety, keeping the disaster from being even worse. And this is Braddock's sash, which Washington appears to have brought home with him, stained with the general's blood. After that battle, the Earl of Halifax said, "I know nothing of Mr. Washington's character, but that we have it under his own hand that he..." The Reverend Samuel Davies even built a sermon about how Providence preserved Washington from harm that day. So that had made him a celebrity in North America. And he spent the next 2.5 years as war was taken over by the regular British Army, so there were a lot more soldiers, and he was suddenly a same-sized fish in a much bigger pond, and he kept aiming for higher status, equal status to the British regulars, and not getting it. Administration as any other patriot born in America. And then in 1759, he retired to married life as the Master of Mount Vernon for 15 years. Now, the other delegates at the First Continental Congress knew that story. They had reason to respect Washington as a war leader as well as a gentleman like themselves. Furthermore, there was a rumor going around that Washington was ready to return to the field of battle in their crisis with the crown. Silas Deane wrote home to his wife in Connecticut. It is said that in the House of Burgesses, on hearing of the Boston Port Bill, he offered to raise an arm and lead 1,000 men. Lynch of South Carolina. He told us that Colonel Washington made the most eloquent speech at the Virginia Convention that ever was made. Says he, I will raise 1,000 men, subsist them at my own expense, and march myself at the head of their relief for Boston. That rumor was false. And indeed, Washington's complete silence, or apparent silence, at the Congress should have raised doubts about him as a military man, even 15 years after he had stepped down from the Virginia regiment. And in fact, privately, Washington was among the very first patriots to imagine an armed conflict with the Crown. The Virginian Arthur Lee later wrote about being at Mount Vernon in July 1768 and hearing Washington say that he was ready to 69. Washington wrote to his neighbor George Mason, at a time when our lordly masters in Great Britain will be satisfied with nothing less than the deprivation of American freedom, no man should scruple or hesitate a moment to use arms in defense of so valuable a lesson. And that was so dangerous to disguise it. Now, shortly after the First Continental Congress began their formal sessions in Philadelphia, the delegates were alarmed by news from Massachusetts. This was the event that historians have come to call the powder alarm, and that much of the action took place right on the street outside, and I've spoken about it many times in what is now a Somerville, and mushroomed into rumors that the British Army and Navy were attacking the people. On September 6th, 1774, in Philadelphia, Robert Treat Paine wrote in his diary, we were informed that the soldiers had fired on the people in town at Boston. This news occasioned the Congress to adjourn at 8 o'clock p.m. The city of Philadelphia in great concern. The bells muffled rang all to Boston. A confused account, but an alarming one indeed. And it wasn't until September 8th, 2 days later, that Adams could add, the happy news has brought us from Boston that no blood had been spilled. And thus, for more than a day, the Congress delegates were forced to think about what they would do if Washington's neighbors also took steps. Under the leadership of George Mason, they formed the Fairfax Independent Company of Volunteers, a militia company which was outside the royal governor's control. In October, that organization wrote to Washington in Philadelphia asking him to be their colonel and to buy flags, drums, and other things. He did was to have an indentured tailor sew a new suit of regimentals for him. The Fairfax County Independent Company's uniform was blue, turned up with buff, with plain yellow metal buttons, buff waistcoat and breeches, and white stockings. This is the Virginia Regiment's uniform. By choosing buff and blue, the Fairfax County Volunteers were choosing the colors of the Whig movement in Britain, which is that little metal a crescent which hangs in front of his chest, and epaulets. He was buying the insignias of an officer. That winter, more men in Virginia formed independent companies, and they all, Richmond and Spotsylvania County. He helped other companies order gunpowder, officers' insignia, muskets, guides to military drills. And as winter ended, Washington was busy inspecting and drilling the militia in nearby Alexandria. So he was going back into a military career. On January 12th, John Pinckney's Virginia Gazette published a song with a verse showing that what force was supposed to oppose the royal Carleton's Canadian whoop. Brave Washington shall give the word, and we'll make them howl and whoop. But that was Virginia. What about the rest of America? What did they think about Washington? Well, around the turn of the years, and in particular, he addressed rumors in the British press that Colonel Charles Lee, who had been given a general's rank in Poland, would be the leader of the armed American rebellion. And the Pennsylvanian said, it is a falsehood that the general has offered to head our troops. He is too much to the most experienced foreign officers. Moreover, the colonies are not so wrapped up in General Lee's military accomplishments as to give him preference to Colonel Putnam and Colonel Washington, men whose military talents and achievements have placed them at the head of the American heroes. There are several 100,000 Americans who would face any danger with these illustrious heroes to lead them. That writer referred to bravery, and of course to Colonel George Washington. So already people outside of Virginia were starting to think of Washington as a potential commander for all the colonies, and this was around the turn of the year into 1775. Meanwhile, between the First and Second Continental Congresses, Washington met with two men who had been high-ranking officers in the British Army and had retired to America. And the first was none other than former Colonel. We met back during Braddock's campaign, and again at Philadelphia during the Congress. And Washington had heard about Lee's plan to organize American battalions. In April 1775, Lee came to Mount Vernon again. Later, in early May, former Major Horatio Gates came to visit Washington. Gates was known as an experienced military commander in the British. He had been preparing himself and shoring up his own alliances and support. In March 1775, Virginia Patriots met in Richmond to choose delegates to the Second Continental Congress. They chose the same men as before, but this time they gave Washington even more votes, an even higher percentage than before, just one fewer than Peyton Randolph. So the at the top of the list, near the top. In late April, Washington heard that the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, had seized Williamsburg's supply of gunpowder, just as General Gage had done in Massachusetts. We don't know what Washington's immediate reaction to that was, but on May 31st, he commented to George William Fairfax in Britain, "Unhappy it is, though, to reflect that a brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's breast, and that the once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or..." And in fact, the people were starting to push their political leaders along. On April 29th, the Virginia militia started to rise. Hundreds of armed men gathered in Fredericksburg, and some of the independent militia companies wanted Washington to lead them on a march to Williamsburg, to the colonial capital. But he, like Speaker Randolph, urged Philadelphia. Again, this was after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Clearly a war had begun in North America, and the next Continental Congress would have to decide on a way to respond. And Washington had been... When they stopped in Baltimore, Maryland, one man recorded, "Colonel Washington, accompanied by the rest of the delegates, reviewed the troops." So he was inspecting the local militia. He was also presenting himself differently in one very significant way that spring. He was wearing the buff and blue in Congress in his uniform, and by his great experience and abilities in military matters is of much service to us. Now, as the Washington scholar Peter Henriquez has written, when you are over 6 feet tall, of imposing, it can't come as a total shock to you to discover that you are being seriously considered for a leadership position. This time, the Congress met in the Pennsylvania State House, which is now called, spoiler, Independence Hall. On May 10th, the delegates from Massachusetts arrived. John Hancock and Samuel Adams were acclaimed for having supposedly escaped the Redcoats at Lexington. Peyton Randolph called West for the advice and support of the assembled colonies. Should this Congress in Massachusetts claim the official role of government? The delegates quickly went into a committee of the whole so they could keep their deliberations secret, both from the press and from us. The Rhode Island delegate, information on much of the congressman's debates that spring is limited. Nevertheless, the official record shows that Washington was becoming more prominent. As I said before, Washington had served on no committees at the First Continental Congress, but in this Congress he not only served on committees, but he was made the chairman of committees when they dealt with military matters. May 27th, to consider of ways and means to supply these colonies with ammunitions and military stores. Needless to say, the imperial government in London would have deemed that completely illegal. From their provincial congress, signed by Dr. Joseph Warren as the presiding officer. And by this point, Peyton Randolph had gone home to preside over the Virginia legislature, and John Hancock had taken the chair at the Continental Congress. The Massachusetts letter proposed that the Continental Congress should be taking the regulation and general direction of the army besieging Boston for the general defense of the right of America. In other words, in exchange for the other colonies' support. That support included money, it included the possibility of more troops, It included a united front, and to secure that support, New England leaders were willing to welcome an experienced commander-in-chief from another kind of Artemus Ward, the current general. On May 7th, he wrote to John Adams that the soldiers seemed to me to want a more experienced direction. I could, for myself, wish to see your friend Washington and Lee at the head of it, and yet dare not propose it, though I have it in contemplation. If you establish a Continental Army of which this will be only a part, you will place the direction as you please. And another was Elbert Gary would prevent their submitting to be led by any general not an American. Yet I cannot help but think that General Lee might be so established as to render great service by his presence and counsels with our officers. I should heartily rejoice to see this way the beloved Colonel Washington, and do not doubt that the New England generals would acquiesce in showing Generalissimo, and that meant general of all the generals, or top general, commander-in-chief. Gary added, "This is a matter which Dr. Warren agrees with me." So the Massachusetts delegates were hearing from their colleagues back at Continental Congress's debate about taking control of the Army. In fact, the formal record makes it look like the Congress just sort of backed into that decision. On June 3rd, the Congress resolved to borrow £6,000 for the purchase of gunpowder for the use of the Continental Army. Now, officially, there was no Continental Army, but the body was clearly moving towards establishing one. Money necessary to be raised. Raised for what? Again, it doesn't say, but everybody knew that the purpose was to fund this army. On June 14th, the Congress assigned Washington to chair a committee to bring in a draft of rules and regulations for the government of the Army. Again, they were giving him the responsibility for military matters, and on that same day, the Congress formally committed itself to the Continental government rather than individual states. And that's why June 14th is recognized as the date of the founding of the U.S. Army. That same day, one of the Virginia delegates wrote a letter home, later printed in the Virginia Gazette, and it said, "Colonel Washington has been pressed to take the supreme command of the American troops. Reluctance, he being deeply impressed with the importance of that honorable trust and diffident of his own superior abilities." So even though the Congress's formal record doesn't say it had offered him the job yet, men were urging him to take that job. And there's no surviving indication that anyone at the Congress wanted someone else instead. To be sure, the delegates were supposed to keep their secrecy. But under the rose, I believe that 10,000 men will be maintained in Massachusetts and 5,000 will be at New York in the Continental expense. So Adams was spilling secrets all over the place to Abigail, but he didn't write anything in 1775 about difficulty appointing. Would take over this army, that it would create a Continental Army. There was very little controversy over choosing George Washington to be the commanding general. He had as much military experience in the largest and oldest colonies. He also offered some assurance to people who might be worried about New England troops, about these zealous New Englanders causing trouble, that somebody with more responsibility would be overseeing them. As John Adams wrote to Abigail on June 17th, making Washington the commander will have a great effect in cementing and securing the union of these colonies. Finally, on June 15th, all the Continental forces raised or to be raised for the defense of American liberty. That $500 per month be allowed for his pay and expenses. The Congress then proceeded to the choice of a general by ballot when George Washington Esquire was formally nominating Washington to be general. And the phrase by ballot in the record indicates that the delegates voted in writing, making the unanimous choice all the more impressive. The next morning, John Hancock officially informed Washington of his appointment to take the supreme command of all the forces raised and to be raised. And the Virginian rose from his seat and said, "Though I am truly sensible of the high honor done me in this appointment, may not be equal to the extensive and important trust. However, as the Congress desire it, I will enter upon this momentous duty." And then more and more self-deprecation. Finally, Washington turned down the salary. saying that he would only keep it observers. It reflected the Whiggish ideal of a statesman acting above self-interest. Though, of course, everyone in the room expected the Congress to support Washington and his household in a genteel style. The Congress then chose a committee to draft a commission and instructions for the general. That consisted of Richard Henry Lee, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge of South Carolina's response to the Crown, and Rutledge was one of the most reluctant about that response. So their cooperation further helped to unify the Congress behind this move. John Hancock would sign this commission on June 19th, at which point Rush wrote in his autobiography about a dinner on June 18th. A few days after the appointment of General Washington to be commander-in-chief of the American armies, I was invited to a dinner which was given to him at a tavern on the banks of the Schuylkill. The first toast was given after the dinner was the commander-in-chief of the American armies. General Washington arose and drank the toast standing. This scene, so unexpected, was a solemn one. A silence followed it, as if every heart were penetrated with the awful but great events that were to follow. And Rush also wrote, about this time I saw Patrick Henry at his lodgings, who told me that General Washington had been with him and informed him that he was unequal to the station in which his country now tell you. From the day I enter upon this command of the American armies, I date my fall and the ruin of my reputation. The general didn't display such doubts publicly, but of course he would never have done that. Now, while all that drama was going on, the Congress turned to the task of appointing more generals to assist Washington and deciding on their relative rank. Washington's experienced British Army officers, so the Congress had to commission them too. And it made sense to appoint Gates to be adjutant general, which is an administrative position that didn't really have to be a senior one. But what do you do with Lee, who everybody knows has more military knowledge than anybody else on the continent? And there were at least half a dozen generals already appointed, trying to figure out their relative rank at a distance. So how are they going to fit in these new generals? And that's where I think we might be able to bring back old John Adams's faulty memory. In his book, The Invention of George Washington, the historian Paul Longmore hypothesized that the difficult politicking Adams where he ranked among the other generals. And indeed, on June 18th, Adams told Elbridge Gerry, I have never in all my lifetime suffered more anxiety than in the conduct of this business. The choice of officers and their pay has given me great distress. So it looks like the Adams cousins might have wanted to make Lee second in command. Delegates supported that idea as well. Adams remembered that argument, remembered the question that people were speaking up for Ward, where people were speaking up for Lee, but he didn't remember exactly where that fit into the timeline. And he probably didn't want to remember pushing for Charles Lee, who sort of disgraced himself later in the war. But in 1775, there wasn't really a big disagreement at the Congress about commissioning Washington to lead the army. It was that next level down. And Samuel Adams was able to write home to James Warren in Massachusetts, we have appointed the generals you asked for. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take questions about anything that was unclear or other things involved in this decision of choosing George Washington to Cambridge and eventually to this house.
Slightly ancillary, is there any description of Washington arriving on July 3rd at Cambridge Common to take command?
Is there any description of Washington arriving to take command? Last year, my Evacuation Day lecture was all about the Washington elm, which is part of this story of this tree that was shaped like no, there is no contemporaneous support for that. It was a legend that's blown up. He actually arrived on July 2nd. It was rainy. He went to a house which no longer exists. It was near the Harvard Law School. He exchanged the paper. Shortly after that, he and Charles Lee, now his third in command, went out and were starting to inspect the positions of the siege lines around Boston. So there wasn't time or inclination to have a big ceremonial handover the way Currier and Ives and other 19th century artists and historians doing that story. And we have an elm that stands in for the elm that was there in 1775. But you can see my lecture on YouTube from last year, and there's a whole different story involved in the creation of that legend and in what it signifies in American culture. There were other things that as I say, that really seems to have been mostly a creation of 19th century chroniclers. Yes,
How did Lee, going from being held in such high esteem, disgrace himself later on? He was going to be chosen, and then...
How did Charles Lee go from being thought of as a military genius, and he spent the remaining years sort of wandering. He had an estate in West Virginia, and he would go back and forth with his dogs, and eventually died fairly early on, before the end of the war, I think, or shortly afterwards. And he had been about, can you believe people thought Charles Lee should be in charge? Well, he might have been one of the people who thought Charles Lee should be in charge. Well, he might have been one of the people who thought Charles Lee should be in charge. He certainly had complimentary things to say about Charles Lee later in 1775. There is a recent biography of Lee which suggests that he might have had bipolar disorder. Yes.
You mentioned Dr. Warren. Was he a traitor?
Was Dr. Joseph Warren a traitor or spy? No.
No.
He was the major leader of the British, the Boston Patriots to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, and John Hancock got sick, and then they came back. But again, in the spring of 1775, when Adams and Hancock were staying out of Boston, other people were trying to make sure they weren't arrested. Warren was the man inside Boston who was out with the messages on April 18th, for instance. However, Dr. Warren had a very trusted colleague, Dr. Benjamin Church, Jr., and he was a spy. And he was actually detected here at the house in September 1775. He was kept confined in another house with the enemy. All they could show is that he had sent a letter in code into Boston, but he complained that I'm clearly overstating what our capacity is. I'm trying to intimidate them from getting out. I'm trying to do my service. There are other letters that have been found in the British archives and General Gage's papers showing that Church had been giving Gage secret and sensitive information since February 1775 at least. So he was definitely a spy, and he was half of those letters also. Church was eventually, they were never able to get in that time the evidence to convict him, but eventually they finally decided to put him on a ship and send him to Martinique to be in exile, and the ship was lost at sea.
I assume Church Street was not named after him.
It was not named after him. It's named because there's a family. There are engravings. In fact, Paul Revere made an engraving which says Colonel Benjamin's grandfather, who was very involved in the wars against the natives at the end of the 1600s. And so having the name Benjamin Church, that alone seemed to represent regional patriotism. And as I say, Dr. Benjamin Church was very involved in the Patriot movement in the 1760s and early 1770s. Everybody trusted him. There is a letter from Dr. Warren. Then the very next month we have information in General Gage's intelligence files that could only have come from Dr. Church. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask you talked about the Massachusetts delegation going down to Philadelphia being willing to entertain Washington from Virginia as the commander. Was there a lot of discussion in Massachusetts about whether this was a purely political move, or?
Was there discussion in Massachusetts? We don't have wanted to undercut Artemus Ward publicly.
Okay.
Clearly, James Warren, who is not a relative of Dr. Joseph Warren, but another Massachusetts politician, he really didn't like Artemus Ward. And so he took every possibility of complaining about how he didn't keep discipline in his camps, wasn't enforcing the rules enough, who wanted to replace Ward. I think Ward himself, he had been a colonel back in the French and Indian War also. He also had a great deal of military experience. He was a pretty good administrator. And he had been an active politician in the Massachusetts legislature. And so I think he understood the value of getting the support, was able to work grudgingly with, he and Washington did not get along very well. And I don't think it was, I think it was just a difference of temperament and not that there was real sort of parted ways. Ward was actually the commander during the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was the crucial battle of the... Yes,
it was really in that. And then, well, is that substantiated? Historians deal with these conflicts. There are people looking back, because from the time, as you pointed out, are often missing a lot of information.
Except, of course, they're always biased and short-sighted, and they don't information you can find about a document. Who's sending it, when, what do they know, and something later, and clearly meant for public consumption. Well, that's obviously trying to shape the story. He has benefit of the doubt and deference to what he has to say, and yet there just isn't. His family kept his diaries, kept his letters, so that we can go back and then look at his emotional state later and figure things out. There are other things like Patrick Henry telling him that Washington felt that his reputation, even if that story is completely accurate to everybody's point of view, how accurate is that? I can't say, but it's those men would have put anything as dangerous as that on paper at the moment. So you really have to balance sources and use as much as you can. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I guess on the topic of sources, I was wondering if there were any records of the British Army's leadership, like the other possible candidates.
It's. I don't think there was. I think they just. I think Thomas Gage was on Braddock's march. He was actually wounded, so he knew Washington. But from their point of view, what Washington represented was this rebel army, and so a legal act by this mass movement that they had to quash and certainly not recognize. So one of the things that happened later in the siege, at the end of the siege, Gage had by this point long gone back to Britain, and it was a man named William Howe who was the general in charge, and messages to through the Boston selectmen to Washington, but he refused to send any message directly to Washington. And then later on in the year, he also refused to address Washington in those letters as His Excellency the General, because that would recognize the authority of the rebel Congress. And he was told basically how they saw Washington. They had to address him, they had to approach him as an outlaw leader rather than think of him as their equal early in the war. Yes?
Washington comes to Cambridge Common, and he's obviously been not appointed general, elected general, essentially, commander-in-chief. I'm an historian of Europe, so forgive me, I'm a very black hole when it comes to American history, which is why I'm interested in your talk. By accepting that position as commander-in-chief, do you think it was implicit, emerged victorious, that he was also essentially accepting the role as statesman of this new country?
Did Washington have political ambitions or plans as well as military? No, he definitely did not. He was quite pleased at the end of the war to give up his command, go back, ran for the Virginia House of Burgesses again after that in the mid-1780s. This was part of the ideal exemplified by the Roman general Cincinnatus, which is why he and his officers created the Society of the Cincinnati, people who, when they went back to their private life. Now, of course, Washington's retirement lasted from 1783 to 1787, when he showed up at the Constitutional Convention and chaired that, and then became the president for as long. I think he would have preferred for the system to have worked, for the American state to get its act together, and for the Continental Congress or Confederation Congress at that point to work. But when he saw that it was not working, he stepped forward again, and he resumed a public life, in this case as a civilian. Congress, suggesting anybody else to be the commander-in-chief. He doesn't seem to have suggested anybody else to be the president. So I think he did feel that he would be the best person for the job. It's just, it wouldn't have been the job that he chose, unless it was absolutely necessary, and that's how he viewed it. I think, in fact, people would have seen the idea of being a general and then becoming head of it. So that 4-year gap was actually very important for his reputation. Not to mention that he was elected, so we can give that his credit. Any other questions? Any other thoughts on the 250th?
Just a curiosity.
Did Washington get reimbursed? Oh yes. In fact, one of our best sources for his time as general was this notebook he kept of all the money he had spent. And so when I did a study on his life here in the house, that was one of the prime sources, because it said, for instance, he had personal control over the choice of wines and anything to do with horses. All the other food, all the other, in this account, there's one point he says that he's putting aside a very large sum to induce somebody to go into Boston undercover as a spy. There are other things that we can see daily life through his accounts, and yes, he was reimbursed in full, and especially compared to his men, and that was expected in the 18th century for how a general should live. There is even a book out that's published during the bicentennial period, which argues that he actually made more money by being reimbursed than he would have, or by accepting the expenses on him and then being reimbursed, than he would have by his salary. So he was giving up this fairly hefty sum of $500 a month. The other generals did accept their salaries. In fact, Colonel Lee, the reason he wasn't appointed immediately, in Britain, which could be confiscated if they decide I'm a rebel, you have to indemnify me for that. And so they had to come up with a special deal for Colonel Lee that he would not lose money to become a Continental Army general. And he accepted his salary until he was booted out of the army. Yes, sir.
So John Kenneth Galbraith said that when there's two kinds of money running around, people always want to be paid. So in talking about Washington, was he paying out in pounds sterling because there were no American currency yet? And was he then repaid in American dollars that were maybe unstable in value?
This was there was what was called specie, which was actual silver, a little bit of gold in circulation, and copper, metal money, and that was worth its metallic value. So if you had a pound of in an English coin and a pound of Spanish coins and a pound of Dutch coins, there weren't that many actual coins, species. So every colony issued its own notes. Plus there was, starting in May 1775, Continental notes. And those were all basically bonds that you would be able to redeem in the future with usually a little bit of interest. The government that issued them. And then by giving them to somebody else, you were forcing that person also to make the investment. There were also personal notes or bank notes when banking became established in the New Republic. And the notes on the bank, you had to look at them and say, okay, I recognize the name of this merchant and he's good for it. Or I don't recognize the name, well, I've heard of this guy, but he's in Newport and it would cost me, and that means that when you were doing anything with paper money, you had, the face value was not sacrosanct. You had to do an extra calculation in your mind about how much it was really worth to you and how much it would be really worth to somebody else if you passed it along. So it was extremely complicated. Washington had both continental currency, piece of paper printed and signed. He used them for different things. So I think he paid that spy in actual specie, and he paid some other things in specie, but he would pay the soldiers in continental currency. And that became a problem because the Continental Congress fell behind their supply lines, and their pay didn't do a very good job. And then as soon as the siege was over, he resigned. So suddenly there was no paymaster general, as the whole army was trying to move down to New York. So it was a problem all along, and that was even before inflation kicked in. And inflation became a real problem for the Continental Army and its soldiers as the war went on, and that currency from the Continental Congress, it was that it would never be repaid. And if you needed your money now, you were better off going to somebody and saying, give me 50% of this value now, and you get to risk collecting the whole 100% in 5 years, 6 years, whatever it is. And it wasn't until the establishment of the federal government and Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury that was put onto a steady field, and it became possible to think of the American dollar as actually worth something.
Thank you so much.
I think we have time
For
for
about
Washington
one more
ever,
question.
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. Did the Washington wrote write a
Didn't ever write his own memories
Yeah.
of how he became. No, he wrote very little about his own memories in his lifetime. One of the few times he did, an aide wrote out an account of one of his early campaigns when he was a Virginia officer, and he sort of wrote sort of looking back and trying to explain how things were. We also don't have any. We have very few personal letters from him to Martha or to his relatives. So he, even at the time, we don't have a lot of personal statements of him. He never says, I was terribly surprised to find, or as I pretty formal. Interestingly, Martha burned all the letters that he sent her in the course of their lifetime, except for like 2 or 3 that were stuck at the back of the drawer. I'm going to be away from you for the next. He thought he'd be back at the end of the fall. He was back 8 years later. But so she kept those letters safe. She kept those separate, put them in a drawer, then gave that piece of furniture to is why we have any personal letters from George Washington to Martha Washington at all. And we don't have her letters back to him, so we don't know what she thought. Like she was saying, well, I could have told you that. I knew you were. I'm not surprised. And instead of just pining away and weeping, she came here, and she spent every winter with Washington during the war. So she became a part of the military family. Last question.
I remember reading that Washington was embarrassed by his poor education. So that may be some part of why he didn't write as many letters as somebody like John Adams.
I think, he didn't have the college education of a John Adams or an Artemus Ward, or the lawyers, the statesmen he dealt with. He was self-confident about that. He had spent 15 years overseeing this very large estate. He had commanded the soldiers in Virginia. It was when you needed to do speeches addresses, formal presentations, to really rouse with the drafts of those. And so he did rely on people like Hamilton, on James Madison, on his military secretaries here, Joseph Reed, and so on. So I think that I think the reason we don't have so many personal letters from Washington is because he and Martha and others felt that the personal was not something to do some culling. They cut out everything about one of their sons who became an embarrassment. But you have some very personal comments in Adams's diaries, in the letters between John and Abigail, because they just had a different view of themselves and what was historical and what was valuable than George and Martha Washington did. So thank you all very much.